All right, so hello and welcome back. So today we're taking a look at the battle for the South. How did the Union strategy prevail in the American Civil War? So I should give you my input on this. It's by History March, so they should probably know what they're doing. And by that I mean I'll probably hopefully add something to this on that side. So another thing, we now have a Utreon supporter, so I will leave my description in my description the link to that if you wish to check it out. We will be doing some stuff there. It rhymes with Band of Brothers, Watch Togethers over on that site in the next coming few weeks. So there's that. Also, I don't think there's anything else. Yeah, let's get to it.
Far superior numbers and resources were needed for an invasion of an area the size of Western Europe.
Now that's something people forget is how big the United States is, and just the South, and also that's what I forgot. I'm from Texas, so you could get my perspective on this, which is the Union was right on everything they did. Now, Western Europe is about the size of the South. Yeah, it's pretty accurate. So if you look down here from just Dallas, so this is where roughly Dallas is by the A, kind of. You go all the way out here. Around over here is a 5 hour drive, and that's in Lubbock, which is where I am. If you go even further, another few more hours, you get to El Paso over here. Now, this is really big for Europe. 5 hours in Europe, you drive in a straight line, you could go through a lot of countries. Not so, at least in Texas, but let alone in the United States. We're really big.
For every soldier the South mustered, the North had to recruit, train, and provision 3 to 4 men. A tall ask for a country that had a standing army of only about 16,000 troops when the war began.
I don't know why they say they had to raise that many. There's the military thing or tradition of saying, "Hey, you need 3 to 1 odds to attack a defending position." That's true. Usually, that doesn't mean you have to have 3 to 4 times the amount of soldiers, but okay. But he does bring up a very interesting point, okay? And this is something that a lot of people don't actually know. The United States Standing Army in 1861 was 16,367 soldiers. There was one general, so General Winfield Scott. I believe there might have been there might be two, but he outranked everyone. One, well, he wasn't even 4 star. We didn't have the rank. He was 2, 3 lieutenant general. Um, so again, ranks system worked very differently back then, and there was our army was tiny. This army was really just used to police the Indian territories out here, where the Indians, and yes, I am one. Cherokee actually got forced out of Georgia or South Carolina actually. But that's really what they were for. It was basically just a police force in the United States to deal with territories out here, not really fight. A lot of the militia system, which was still used at this time and will continue to be used basically up till World War One, and then we used National Guards and stuff by then. But basically, every state would just raise a national militia or a state militia for X amount of time. Could be as little as 30 days or 2 weeks if it really wanted to, or as long as they needed to. That's what the United States will basically do. So these are the professional soldiers. The Union will end up with 500,000, maybe more, soldiers in the field. And the total cost of the Civil War is 700,000 something ish U.S. dead, but that's both sides, mostly from disease rather than battlefield casualties. But just know that the Union side up here was heavily more populated than the South. When we can get into reasons that is, but let's keep going.
When the war began. In this video, we will talk about the strategies the Union adopted during the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865, how they evolved, and how they ultimately brought about victory over the Confederate States. So let's get to it. The Union began with significant material advantages. It had 22 million people, while the Confederates had 9 million, with 3 million of them slaves.
Now this is the disproportionate numbers, okay? You can see this is how many men Again, Union versus slave population in the South. Now, the slave population also in the South was very highly concentrated. It was in Mississippi, Tennessee, New Orleans, Louisiana, very deep South. There's a very distinct distinction between like Oklahoma and Texas, which is west, and then the deep South. Okay, you could even say Virginia. They weren't actually the deep South. Virginia and North Carolina weren't really. The deep South is a very specific area in the United States. So Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas. Let's see, what else? Come on. Alabama, Tennessee, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi. Okay, you in Georgia sometimes is referred to as the deep South. Okay, this is where the majority of actual slaves were, but there were still slaves everywhere. Let's not make two ways about it. Especially in the South, there was slaves everywhere. It's just disproportionately there was more concentrated there. And you can see the 3 million slaves and 5,400,000 regular people. So you can see that your conscription size is very tiny.
It had 20,000 miles of rail to the South's 9,000 and was responsible for over 90% of the antebellum US's industrial output. In war, it would produce 30 guns for every one the South made and would mobilize 2 million soldiers to the South's 1 million.
Yeah, I guess I was wrong about the 500,000. But you can see that disproportionately the Union has every single advantage on paper, besides fighting in your own territory. Now, you may ask why it took them 4 years to win. We can get into that, but basically it's retarded generals and retarded generals. I can't stress that enough. In reality, the Civil War should have probably ended in maybe 2 at max if they actually did their job, but that's a story we can get into.
Under Abraham Lincoln, the North's war aims were clear: preserve the Union. But how could this be achieved, and how to do it at least cost? Initially, proposals such as the Crittenden Compromise tried to solve the issue peacefully. Lincoln, however, rejected compromising on the sticking point of slavery.
Okay, that's not necessarily true. So, let's get this. Union war aims, 1861, 1862. Preserve the Union at all costs. So, my European friends, the war was not fought over slavery in the very beginning. Let's be very clear here. At least on the northern side, it was not. I mean, they could have wanted to free slaves, but anyway, preserve the Union. If Lincoln could reintegrate the South without freeing the slaves, he would have done that. Just know that that's what the war aim was in the beginning. This Brentwood Compromise, okay? And an amendment to the Constitution that was going to basically, Congress would be forbidden to interfere in slave matters. It was rejected by him because it was going to fail anyway. By this time, they were already breaking away. It didn't matter even if this compromise passed. Lincoln was seen as the abomination that would destroy it anyway. So that wasn't going to happen.
Not just because of moral and intra-party factors, but also because he feared setting a precedent for what he saw as Southern extortion of the federal government.
If we surrender, it is the end of us and of the government. They will repeat upon us ad librum. A year will not pass till which we shall have to take Cuba as a condition upon which they will stay in the Union. Okay, so this is getting into something different, but basically the South wanted to continue to expand because this compromise line is the Nebraska compromise line, Missouri compromise. There's a lot of compromises. Just so you know, there is a line, the 36th, 38th parallel, basically, or 36th, 30 parallel. Basically, no new slaves new states could have slavery above this line. New Mexico could vote and California could vote. California voted no. So to expand slavery to continue, the South wanted to take over Cuba, expand it into the Caribbean, and maybe get Mexico. That's how their expansion plan was going to do so. And the reason they wanted to do that was because eventually, if the compromise set in stone that you can't have slave states above basically Oklahoma, the Missouri compromise line, basically if that was to take place, the South would eventually run out of senators because each state gets 2 senators. If the North have more states, they have more senators, therefore they can outvote the South. That's why they wanted to continue to expand slavery.
A precedent for what he saw as Southern extortion of the federal government. More forceful strategies soon took over. General-in-Chief Winfield Scott proposed doing what was done during the nullification crisis, which was to hold the remaining coastal forts, demonstrate federal authority by collecting import duties, and dare the Confederates to fire the first shot.
And this is important to remember. It says October 1861, okay? Abraham Lincoln was not in office. Buchanan was still in office at this point. Lincoln won't take over presidency of the United States until March 1861, okay? So everything before March 1861, he legitimately has nothing to do with it. It was already happening, which is why, as I said, that amendment was not going to do anything.
In April 1861, the South did just that against Fort Sumter. Despite the outbreak of hostilities, Lincoln, Scott, and many Northerners assumed that most Southerners were still pro-Union, and given the right circumstances, they would overthrow the secessionists.
And that was very wrong, okay? This was seen as a second war of independence against a tyrannical government by the South, by my people. Now, this Northern support didn't exist, and they will find that out very quickly. And it will also take them many years to find out that, no, the South actually really hates the Yankees, which will turn into the Yankees being like, yeah, this isn't our country anymore, burn stuff, all that stuff.
The North should therefore stand firm, but restrain itself. Major military action would only generate anti-Union sentiment, or worse, an insurgency. Such thinking informed Scott's Anaconda Plan of May 1861. First, the Union would strengthen its blockade against southern ports. Then a force of 60,000 to 80,000 would move down the Mississippi and secure New Orleans.
Now, part 1 of this will be complete relatively quickly. Why? The entire U.S. Navy sided with the Union. The entire U.S. Navy sided with the Union, basically. I mean, you had sloops in the South. So, all of the major ships, everything went to the Union. So they enforced a massive blockade against the South. So that's already strike number 2 for the South. Now you can't import anything. The securing the Mississippi River really won't happen until 1863, 1864. We take New Orleans relatively early on in the Union, but going down to Memphis and then Vicksburg, again, it takes a long time for us to actually achieve this. And Grant takes Vicksburg in a masterful campaign. But
thus encircled, the Confederates would realize their situation and stand down, given enough time. The Anaconda Plan blocked important supplies from reaching the Confederate Army, but it also touched every aspect of life in the South. As we mentioned earlier, the Anaconda Plan was very time-sensitive. But time was what Lincoln didn't have. Already the papers were calling for a swift march to Richmond to end the conflict, and there were concerns that patience would be interpreted as Union weakness, raising Southern confidence as well as the possibility of foreign intervention. But swift action turned out not to be the solution either, as the Union Army advanced and was defeated at First Bull Run.
okay, it depends on who. It's either First Manassas or First Bull Run, depending if you're the South of the Union. Okay, this international support. I mean, I'm also gonna say it wasn't an issue, but it was not an issue, not really. Who were the South going to get international support from? Britain? Britain was gonna join their side? Britain that abolished slavery and was a very firm anti-slavery stance? No. France? France has its own problems. Let alone is it going to come over here and help the South, which again, they're very anti-not. I mean, they still had slaves, but was a very less so degree in France. Okay. On top of all of this, basically, they're basically trying to say that if the Union waiting was not an option. Fine, it's not an option. Problem is, as you can see, the South actually had more troops at the Battle of First Manassas, or First Bull Run, and kicked the Union's ass. Very seldomly.
as the Union Army advanced and was defeated at First Bull Run. November 1861 saw George B. McClellan become General-in-Chief.
And that was a mistake that cost this war to be 4 years. If that man specifically was not appointed to the command of the Army of the Potomac, this war would have been over in 2 to 3 years, at max. He was let me choose my words here very carefully, an incompetent general that shouldn't have been in command of the Union Army. Now, he was a very good administrator. He had absolutely no tactical sense whatsoever, and if he thought the South outnumbered him as the Union. And remember, 29 million people, 5 million people. He thought their army was bigger than his, so he didn't move until he got more men. And this will continue to happen. And it will continue to happen. And then a diversionary attack will happen, and he'll be like, no, I can't move. So then Lee will move his troops, kill a diversionary attack, come back. George B. McClellan is a very bad general. And he will stay as a very bad general for a long time, way longer than he should have.
Tasked with forming a strategy for winning what was now clearly a war. McClellan shared the rosy view on Southern pro-Union sentiment, but he also brought a unique dimension to Union strategy. Firstly, faulty intelligence made him consistently believe that Confederate forces in Virginia outnumbered him significantly.
It was not faulty intelligence. It was the man himself. Faulty intelligence does not say that you don't have those many men. I mean, just do simple math here, okay? He always said that he was outnumbered consistently. That was not what the scouts were saying. Scouts were saying that the South was very weakly defended in some points when he actually advances on Richmond. He will get reports back saying, hey, they're actually not here. Should we attack? He's like, no, please. They have more men than me. So that's not on the scouts, really. That's on him.
Secondly, McClellan saw that the South occupied the strategic interior lines and therefore could theoretically concentrate more troops faster than the Union could.
Theoretically, okay? So if two armies march against each other, an enemy with a force interior lines that follows the latter that could affect the Union before the former and inevitably defeat him, okay? Essentially, Union armies had to travel around circumference of the South while the Confederate used direct routes. Okay, here's a problem with this. When General Lee takes over, so Joseph E. Johnston right now is technically in command. And he's actually very good. He actually was a very good general. Better than Lee. And Longstreet was too. But this redeploying of Confederate forces into like Nashville is something that the Army of Virginia basically won't do. When Lee takes command of it, he will not send anyone west. Even though it very seldomly could have prevented a lot of stuff happening, he will refuse to send it. Bumbling, orders, all that stuff. He was very interested in defending Virginia. Just like most of the Confederacy is very interested in defending their own states, not fighting for the Confederacy, because, that's an oxymoron, right? So theoretically they could have done this, but they really didn't do it in practice.
Lastly, McClellan had also observed the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 and noted there that attacking entrenched positions head-on was a very risky endeavor. To neutralize these perceived Confederate advantages...
I mean, that was true, but that was the Crimean War. Not only that, I'm pretty sure McClellan didn't actually go there, but we'll go check. Okay, so I was wrong. He was at Crimea. Now, there are different points to take away from the Crimean War. He is right when he says assaulting a direct position that is entrenched would lead to high casualties. The problem is, that kind of warfare doesn't really take place in the U.S. Civil War until 1860, very late 1863, 1864. And then it goes through 1865. That's when actual trench warfare really ramps up in the U.S., okay? Like, we're talking around like World War I kind of standards of amount of trenches were being built. 1861 and 1862, when he was actually in command, and even the beginning part of 1863, that was not a thing. People did not entrench like that. So he is technically right, but that doesn't make him right for not attacking.
To neutralize these perceived Confederate advantages, McClellan wanted to disperse Southern strength, maneuver its armies out of position, and win decisively before they could reconcentrate.
Valid points. He's not as stupid generally, he's just completely incompetent. I'll just say that.
A quick victory would also end secession without addressing slavery, avoiding permanent Southern hostility and a potential race war.
I don't think that was on his mind, though. I don't even think that was on anyone's mind. For the prevention of... To prevent a race war and to not end slavery was a reason they wanted to end the war very fast. I don't think that was on their top of their list. When they broke away, finally, they're like, yeah, we'll preserve the Union by winning fast, sure, but wasn't in fact to be like, yes, we can prevent slavery and a race war. Right, that doesn't make sense.
McClellan's strategy to achieve this was to attack simultaneously at multiple points. In the east, an army 270,000 strong would pin the Confederates in Virginia.
Okay, again, I want you to see these numbers here. 270,000 men under his command. Johnson's army has 45,000 guys. McClellan estimated that they had 170,000 because that's what he thought. So he asked for more men, and he got more men. He has 270,000 versus 45,000 troops in Virginia. Okay, we'll just keep going.
In the west, a 20,000-man force would secure the Mississippi and take Tennessee, threatening the Deep South and also outflanking the Confederate position in Virginia. Movements in Missouri, Arkansas, and Texas would tie down local forces, while the Navy would capture ports and allow Union raiders to disrupt the South's railroads.
Okay, this all makes sense on a strategic level, okay? He has a brain for strategy. He knows kind of what to do on this, and this is a solid plan. Divert his forces, blockade, take ports, 270,000 men to pin down the Army of Virginia, and you win. Okay? This should have worked. There's legitimately almost no reason for this to not work, except McClellan. And he's tactically inept, and that's what comes to really bite him in the ass.
The Confederacy thus overstretched. McClellan's Eastern Army would then march down the Atlantic seaboard, defeat the South's scattered armies, and win the war. Parts of McClellan's strategy were successfully executed. In the west, Ulysses S. Grant took Forts Henry and Donelson, opening the Mississippi for the Union and forcing the Confederate out of Kentucky. By February 1862, Union forces were at Nashville. They repelled the Southern counteroffensive at Shiloh, then decided to follow the Confederate army to Corinth instead of advancing on Chattanooga. The Navy took New Orleans in April and made an attempt on Vicksburg in May.
Okay, so just think about this. Everything is going according to plan in the West. Okay, they're destroying the South. They are taking their objectives. All going to be on McClellan now to pull his weight.
But the critical part of the plan, McClellan's Army of the Potomac, failed. Unwilling to risk a head-on battle against the Confederates with only 150,000 men.
Yeah, with only 150,000 men. He had 270, damn near 300,000 by the time he actually does this.
McClellan first delayed, then in March attempted a flanking movement at Richmond via the Virginia Peninsula. He took too long, and by September the Confederates, under Robert E. Lee, had ejected the Union from most of Virginia.
So, okay, let's go back a little bit here. So, before the Second Battle of Bull Run, which gets his ass absolutely destroyed, the 7 Days Battle, okay? So, McClellan's strategy, you may ask why he didn't, march on Richmond. Well, he didn't want to fight a big battle, but let's get away from that. His strategy was he was going to flank the defenses of Richmond, okay? So, he's going to come down here and flank it, while another force of his detachments were going to go north and flank the enemy so he could pincer them, okay? Very good strategy. Would probably work. The problem was Lee's force was tiny at this point, okay? And he successfully fooled McClellan into thinking that he had 150,000 men in front of him when he didn't have that at all. He had 45. He then went north, destroyed the pincer army that had to retreat, came back, fought McClellan, beat his ass, and McClellan retreated all the way up, got second Battle of Bull Run, and back to Washington.
He took too long, and by September, the Confederates, under Robert E. Lee, had ejected the Union from most of Virginia. Lee then invaded the North, and while he was stopped at Antietam, this and the Confederate invasion of Kentucky underscored the South's continued willingness to fight. By this time, Lincoln had accepted that assumptions of Southern pro-Union feeling were wrong, and that the war effort needed to be escalated.
We'll go with that. We'll just say that that's a thing. I've not really heard of this insurgency that they thought was going to happen. But we'll just go with it. Again, the armies in the West, roughly the Union, are just going to keep kicking the Confederates' ass in the West. That's basically just what happens the entire war. Now, McClellan's army is down 84,000 troops, and Lee has 78. So now he doesn't have the advantage. But don't worry, he'll easily get back those numbers.
Grant had already been living off occupied territory since mid-1862. And now William Tecumseh Sherman suggested that deliberate exhaustion of Confederate territory was key to breaking the South's will to fight and achieving victory.
Which basically means you burn everything, you take everything from the civilians, you make life as hard as possible on the civilian population until they give up. And that's a strategy he will run with, and it will be very effective in the South.
The Confiscation Acts, coupled up with updates to the laws of war in 1863, allowed Union soldiers to seize, use, and finally destroy Confederate property, while the Emancipation Proclamation gave the Union moral legitimacy, deterred foreign intervention, and most of all, encouraged Southern slaves to join the North.
Let's talk about all this stuff. So we've already covered Tecumseh Sherman. The Confiscation Acts, basically the reason those had to be passed is because the Union guys went into the South. They saw it as the United States of America. So they didn't want to rob and burn these people's food, livestock, whatever, okay? Little did they realize that the South actually hated these Yankee boys, okay? But the Yankee boys didn't hate them that much in 1861. 1862 rolls around. They're like, okay, no, they actually kind of hate us. So we can confiscate stuff, right? And war assets and slaves were permitted. Then the Confiscation Act of Property and slaves were permitted because slaves were property in the South. The Beer Code 1863, military necessity, allows the destruction of property, so you can rip up railroads, you can burn farms, you can do a lot of other stuff, which will deny the enemy a whole bunch of economic resources that they just don't have. And then the Emancipation Proclamation basically gives the, as he says, the Union complete legitimacy in the world. Britain will now completely never invade us because we are legitimately fighting, instead of to restore the Union, to end slavery in the United States of America. Britain had already outlawed it. Their population will not stand for them intervening into and helping a slave state exist. Not happening. Now, France, it's going to be busy in Mexico reinstalling an emperor, so we'll just leave them down there, okay? They're also busy, so they can't intervene. And literally nobody else cares enough if they were ever going to intervene. They may supply people with weapons and guns and stuff, but they're not going to put boots on the ground, as that term, we'll use that term.
Henry Halleck replaced McClellan as General-in-Chief in July 1862, and in October proposed a plan to fragment the South. Grant, aided by troops from New Orleans, was to capture Vicksburg. The fall of this last stronghold on the Mississippi would not only sever Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the Eastern Confederacy, but would also reopen the river for trade and appease Lincoln's Midwest voters. At the same time, Union forces were to take Chattanooga and Knoxville, cutting what was then the Confederacy's only cross-country railroad, as well as opening the doorway to the Deep South.
Now, there's not some, we can't just look at railways right here, obviously on this map, but this is important. This is the whole strategy that they were saying, that the Confederacy, in theory, could redeploy its forces and fight the Union out west. But if you take this railway, they can't do that. This Vicksburg thing is the right strategy, okay? And it will happen. Grant will launch a masterful campaign in Vicksburg and take the city, okay? Completely cutting off the West, basically, Confederacy. Texas must state the Indian Territory, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana from the rest of the Confederacy, so no more supplies is coming through. I mean, you could get, like, some small river boats, but you're not getting, like, railway lines all the way into Virginia. It's not happening anymore. The capture of Chattanooga would detour through Atlanta and Mobile, blah 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 blah. So basically, you have to just require river transportation. But when they take this, they'll be able to raid Georgia with Sherman, which will be very much due.
In the east, McClellan was replaced with Ambrose Burnside as head of the Army of the Potomac.
Now he's 120,000 men. And again, this number will only keep going up. This number will always keep going down. So again, Lee's outnumbered. But
in November, Halleck wanted Burnside to advance towards Richmond, capture its rail network, and above all, cover Washington and prevent Lee from moving north. Halleck's strategy was initially only implemented by Grant, who from May to July 1863 sieged and captured Vicksburg. No movement was made against Chattanooga for the first half of the year. In the east, Burnside advanced in December 62, but was quickly defeated at Fredericksburg.
All right. So, again, the string of incompetent... Okay, Burnside was not fit for Army command. He might have been a good corps commander and a division commander. And he actually will be relatively later. Okay, but he could not handle Army command, and he even said he couldn't. And the Battle of Fredericksburg is a fiasco, okay? If you watch that god-awful movie, Gods and Generals? Yeah, Gods and Generals. If you watch that god-awful movie, please don't, unless you're like a military historian and you skip to the battles. You will see Burnside had the opportunity to ford the river, but he didn't. He had the opportunity. I'm trying to remember the general's name. He was also at Gettysburg. I'll get his name. Hang on. All right. So it's Winfield S. Scott, okay? Or Winfield S. Scott. It wouldn't have been him. It would have been a few other dudes that would have taken Fredericksburg before Lee got there. Didn't want to do that because he wanted order in the army and his very first command. All of this other stuff is compounding the issue, okay? Long story short, Lee arrives, sets up on a hill overlooking Fredericksburg so he can shoot all of them as they come up. They also get to the town and delay the Union from crossing. When the Union finally crosses, they have to go very much piecemeal into the attack, okay? And basically, Lee is sitting up on a hill with artillery, guns, and a stone wall, and absolutely destroys the Union army as they try to come up. Now, the reason they had to attack the wall was to be a diversionary attack, and I get why they did it, but it was still a monumentously stupid attack that, again, could have been avoided earlier, and outflank, and they actually do outflank. But long story short, the Union gets his ass kicked again. So now we're in 1863.
In December 62, but was quickly defeated at Fredericksburg. While his successor, Joseph Hooker, met the same fate in May 63 at Chancellorsville. George Meade managed to stop Lee's second northern invasion at Gettysburg in July, but then failed to destroy the Confederates in retreat.
Breaking this down. Meade had been appointed in command not even a week before Gettysburg. I think it was like a day he replaced the dude. When he got to Gettysburg, it was when he basically was in charge of the Army of the Potomac, Army of the Potomac. And he wins at Gettysburg, First Army Command. The Union has suffered its most extreme losses it has ever faced in any battle, okay, on both sides. It's extreme losses. He, quote-unquote, could have pursued somebody, but he also won a major victory. Now, Lincoln wrote a letter, never sent it to Meade, but wrote a letter saying, why didn't you pursue and all of that crap, but he didn't send it. He kind of understood that that was not a position that they were able to do. So Lee fell back. Now, George Meade will still be in command of the Army of the Potomac for the rest of the war. General Grant will be appointed General of the Armies, a rank only held by Washington at this point. He will be appointed that rank, so he's in command of Meade, so he's just above Meade, and he can direct the rest of this war. But Meade will retain command of the Army of the Potomac. That's something I don't think people understand or remember.
Furthermore, whatever strategic momentum gained after Vicksburg and Gettysburg was overridden by the declaration of the Second Mexican Empire in July. Fears that the French-backed regime might try to retake Texas for Mexico saw the Union halt its advance and redirect attention to the Trans-Mississippi.
And that actually was kind of a fear. Don't worry, Mexico will definitely kick the French asses out of Mexico, but I'll get to that eventually. But yeah, the tenuous hold that they even had in Mexico, yes, it was a problem. The United States said and guaranteed literally every country in America. So if France did this, they're basically declaring war on the United States because we guaranteed Mexico's independence from them. So yeah, it was actually a very tense issue.
The Confederacy used the breathing space to reorganize. In September, Union forces captured Knoxville and Chattanooga, but were defeated at Chickamauga soon after, thanks to a Confederate corps transferred there from Virginia.
The one time Lee actually sent forces from Virginia out west, they actually made a difference. He didn't do this very often at all because he wanted to defend Virginia. And he sent Longstreet out. Longstreet's one of the really good generals, better than Lee in my opinion. I know, harsh. But the one, again, just one time he actually did send his guys, one, but won't do that again.
Grant, in turn, defeated the Confederate 2 months later, leaving the doorway to the Deep South open. Despite all of its victories, the Union had only slightly moved the front lines in the crucial theaters of Tennessee and Virginia.
Yep, Virginia had been basically, they took Harper's Ferry, and that's about it at this point. 3 years into the war, that's about as far as we've gotten there.
And was still as far from victory as it had been in 1862, with the 1864 presidential election less than a year away. Grant became General-in-Chief in February 1864, resolving to give Lincoln successes to ensure his re-election, if not end the war by November.
Okay, we're going to go for Grant's plan. It's going to be very, very similar, at least to the beginning of 1861. And guess what? He will actually win and kick Lee's ass. It's not like it's not like the Union suddenly had more men than Lee, right? Lee's around 75,000. They still only have 120,000, right? But you will see that the strategy of having actual competent generals will actually beat Lee and everyone else in Virginia.
Before his appointment, he had proposed massing troops in North Carolina in order to outmaneuver Lee from Virginia, but this was rejected, as Lincoln did not want to give Lee the chance to move north. Grant's initial strategy, therefore, followed his predecessor's plans and attacked on multiple fronts. One force would descend on Mobile, while Sherman would advance into Georgia. In the east, Grant saw the destruction of Lee's army as the key to victory.
And that is not false. Lee's army basically was the Confederacy. There were other Confederate units out here, Joseph E. Johnston and a few other guys, Nathan Bedford Forrest, again, guys in the South. But if Lee's army was beat, that was it. And that's basically what happened. When Lee surrendered, the Confederacy was done. I know, it's a shocking plan. Again, this plan is very similar. You attack on all fronts so Lee can't move, and you attack Lee. The problem was all the commanders didn't attack Lee very well and got their ass beat by him. So when you actually attack Lee and you can win, which you should be able to, it actually works.
Meade would advance and pin Lee down, while an amphibious landing south of Richmond, supported by flanking movements down the Shenandoah, would capture that city, cut the railroad between northern and southern Virginia, and surround the Confederate force. Grant's plan, again, only partially worked. Sherman pushed into Georgia in May, but Confederate defensive tactics under Joseph Johnson delayed his progress. The Union force earmarked for Mobile was defeated in Louisiana and never launched the operation.
Now that is true, but Tecumseh Sherman will do something else, trust me. We'll get around Johnston.
In Virginia, Union forces were defeated at the Shenandoah, and the amphibious landing was plugged up by the Confederates, allowing Lee to confront Meade head-on. In response, Grant abandoned his attempts to outmaneuver the Confederates strategically and began to simply grind them down. Starting in May, he fought Lee continuously from the Wilderness to Spotsylvania Courthouse to Cold Harbor.
And this works. He repeatedly punches Lee in the face, okay? And it works. Why does it work? Lee can't replace his men like Grant can. Grant has more men. The envelope strategy was defeated, okay? It didn't work that time. Now, the attacking him frontally actually did. And this will continue to happen all the way to Richmond, and then we'll dig in and we'll talk about that.
Lee continuously from the Wilderness to Spotsylvania Courthouse to Cold Harbor. Within 6 weeks, he had dealt 33,000 casualties and driven Lee's army into Richmond at the cost of 60,000 of his own.
And every other Union general would have retreated by now. That was in the command of the Army of the Potomac, except Meade and Grant over him. Everyone else would have ran back to Washington and given Lee time to regroup. Grant and Meade didn't do that. That's why it worked.
Grant knew that unlike Confederate casualties, Union casualties could be replaced. Still, the strategy was politically risky. Stuck in a long siege with growing casualties and few decisive victories, Grant had to hope for success elsewhere before Election Day. The Union proved lucky in this, as the South abandoned Johnson's defensive strategy in July and decided to fight Sherman head-on. They lost, Atlanta fell to the Union in September, and Lincoln was re-elected in November.
Yeah, Sherman handed it on a silver platter to Lincoln. Okay, but let's talk about this 1864 election, okay? Lincoln won by a landslide. He was probably going to win by a landslide, regardless if he did take Atlanta. Might have been a little more skewed, but his opponent was George B. McClellan, that idiot. And the thing is, it's not like McClellan was going to peace out of the war, okay? Let's run through this. Even if Lincoln got defeated in it, McClellan doesn't take into office until March 20th, I believe, 1865. By that point, the war is basically over, and the Union has won. Even if he took over, it's not like he's going to peace out. He was actually, because he ran on the Democratic ticket, which the Democrats were like wanting a peace settlement kind of thing. He actually was very opposed to his party's idea of ending the war. He was like, yeah, I'll just win the war, because general.
By this time, the Union strategy of exhaustion was in full swing. Philip Sheridan burnt the Shenandoah starting September, while Sherman launched his March to the Sea in November, intending to fully demonstrate the Confederacy's impotence against the Union. Capturing Savannah in December, Sherman burnt Columbia in February 1865, and by March was brushing aside demoralized Confederate resistance in North Carolina.
And you can see why I say this war was basically over in 1865, March. Even Lincoln was defeated, McClellan would have been like, cool, we just win now, right? Basically.
Failing to break the siege before Grant was reinforced, Petersburg and Richmond surrendered in April, with Lee's army following soon after at Appomattox.
Yeah, he surrendered in April. That's not even a single month after McClellan would have taken office.
After 4 years of bloody war and more than 300,000 casualties, the Union had finally achieved victory.
We'll go look at some numbers real quick on the 300,000, because that's a very low estimate. Okay, so Wikipedia is not an amazing source on this, but we'll just go with it, because 300,000 dead is a very low number. More likely, again, just from the news sources that I've been reading that aren't here, it's 700 up to maybe 1 million, depending on what you want to do. 828,000 casualties. The Union just lost 365,000. The Confederacy lost 290 dead. These are just the dead numbers. Again, there's no real way to accurately count this stuff, because it was way before birth records were really a thing. Birth records were written in your family Bible, and that's what you really went off of. So there's really no way to tell, but it was definitely more than 300,000, I can guarantee you that.
Was Confederate defeat inevitable? Material superiority made Union victory more likely with each passing year, but its strategy was initially riddled with incorrect assumptions and incomplete execution. Grant's attrition strategy assumed great political risk, and had the Confederates managed to cumulatively delay the Union in the West by a couple of months, Lincoln may well have lost re-election.
right, let's break this down. I have a problem with that one. Material superiority, yes, the Union had material superiority, and each passing year just got worse for the Confederacy. The Confederacy, on the other hand, also, in my opinion, could have. I don't even know if I want to say it's likely. I just said it was a way more probable chance that they could have won in 1861, 1862. What they had to do was take DC and end the war. They had to go north. They didn't do that. They saw it as a war of independence, and they were fighting in Virginia. That was the better defensive strategy, but that's not going to win you this war. And that was actually the initial plan. Lee did launch, but it got intercepted and he pulled back. But if the Confederacy went on an all-out attack on the Union and took DC and ended the war in 61, 62 by piecing out, probably was their best hope at winning this one, because they have to do a short war. They cannot win a long war at all. The Union could have ended this war in around 2 to 3 years if they basically just punched the Confederacy in the face multiple times and didn't give up. They didn't do that, and they didn't do that until 1864, 1865. Grant's strategy assumed great political risk. I don't know about that. The newspapers were on his ass that he was taking so many casualties because they were horrified by how many casualties he was taking in every day. But the same thing was happening to Lee, and he was actually pushing them all the way to their capital, and he got there. Now, the Confederacy managing to delay the Union a couple of months in the West wasn't going to happen. They had very shit generals in the West, and it just wasn't happening. Lincoln may well have lost the election. I don't know. It was a full landslide for Lincoln. Even if Vicksburg didn't, or sorry, not Vicksburg, even if Atlanta didn't fall to Sherman, I don't know. And even if Lincoln lost, the war ended April 9th. Lee surrendered then. Okay, what is McClellan going to do? 2 weeks? He's gonna surrender the Union in 2 weeks and peace out? That's not happening. Especially not with him. He would keep going. And 2 weeks later, the war ends. And the Union still wins at that point.
Ultimately, the Union managed to create and execute a strategy that played to its strengths and Confederate weaknesses, which is why it achieved the final victory. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give us a like, and don't forget to subscribe if you're new around.
So we'll leave the video there. Hopefully you got something intelligible out of my ranting there, but we're hitting 50 minutes into this. So hope you guys liked it. Please leave a like, leave your comments down below. And if you're a Southerner, I don't know, I'll say hi to you from Texas. Otherwise, I'll see people next time. There's a next video up there if you wish to check that one out. Otherwise, bye-bye.